Hello, I'm Professor Toybox. I've got Sorcerer's Apprentice Mickey with me, and we're back for another episode of Toybox Tutorials. This is the last episode of my 6-part mini-series on camera tutorials. So far, we've looked at each of the 4 different cameras, and last time we looked at how to use a target camera to set up 6 different kinds of camera shots here in the town. And I'm going to use these shots to build a Western-style cutscene. Today, we're going to look at camera transitions and how to switch between multiple cameras, and then we'll use that knowledge to build a complete cutscene using the 6 different camera shots from last week. And again, I apologize for the longer episode today, but it can't really be helped. I'll get the lesson out of the way first, and then if you have time, you can stick around and watch me put together the cutscene and see how it all turns out. Now, switching between multiple cameras sounds like it should be pretty easy, and it is. But there are some things you want to watch out for that can trip you up if you're not careful. And so I've dropped down 2 cameras over here, and a couple of locators for those to look at, as well as a time delayer and a button. And all I've done is place these toys so that you can save a little bit of time. And I'll show you how I can set these up. So first of all, let's go ahead and hook this camera up to that locator over there. That'll be our camera target. And we'll do the same thing for this camera. So a new locator connection, and we'll connect up to that locator. And what I want to do is switch between this camera and switch over to that camera. So we'll just stick with a simple 2-camera setup here first. So under this camera, we'll go down to the properties, and we're going to set this up the simplest way you would think to set this up that should work. And so I'm going to set a defined duration, and we'll set it to be 3 seconds. And everything here looks fine. Camera target needs to be the connected locator, and everything else will leave. So we'll keep this as simple as possible. And then we'll do the same thing for this camera. So under the properties, we'll have this one run for 3 seconds, and it needs to look at the connected locator. All right. So to transition between those 2 cameras, you would think you could do this. On the button, we'll do a new logic connection when pressed, and we'll activate the first camera. And the camera, again, is set up to turn itself off automatically after 3 seconds. So you would do a new logic connection when this camera deactivates itself, come over to this camera, and activate it. And you would think that would work, and it should. But as we push the button, you'll notice it switched immediately over to the second camera's view. And as I pointed out way back in the first episode in this little mini-series, that deactivated trigger signal seems to have a bug. It broadcasts it right away. And so instead of waiting for the 3 seconds for this camera to turn itself off, it broadcasts the deactivated signal immediately. And what that means is we can't use that signal. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that link. And because of that, we need some other way to activate the next camera in the sequence. And for something simple like this, we'll just use a time delayer. And so I'm going to come over to the time delayer properties, and we'll set this to 3 seconds, which corresponds to the amount of time that is on this camera's defined duration. And we'll go ahead and, just for jollies, let's go ahead and turn that off since we have the time delayer. And so we'll still use the button to turn on the first camera, but we'll also have the button start the time delayer. Like that. And so now on the time delayer, we'll do a new logic connection when the delay is completed. Then we'll come over and activate that camera. And let's actually come over here and turn that back on. So I'm kind of getting a little ahead of myself. All right, so the only thing we've done is we deleted the link from this camera to turn that one on, and we're using this time delayer to do it instead. And so now when we come and push the button, we have our first camera, and then we switch to the second camera view. And now we have the behavior that we want. Now, one of the things I want to point out, and you may run into this on your own, it kind of seems obvious, but I'm going to take this define duration off. And what this means is we're going to be activating this camera when we push that button. But right now, there's nothing that'll turn that camera off. And so we're going to push this button. That camera turns on. 3 seconds later, that one turns on. And 3 seconds later, when that one turns off, we come back to camera 1's view. And the reason we do that is because we never turned off camera 1. And so one of the things, and I use the minus to get out of that view, one of the things I want to point out is that when you activate another camera, it doesn't automatically deactivate all of the other cameras. Excuse me. And so when you're activating other cameras and you're working with multiple cameras, you have to remember to explicitly deactivate the previous camera when you activate the next one. And again, you can do that in this case by turning on this flag and letting the camera do it by itself. Or we could come over to the time delayer and have this do a new logic connection when the delay is completed and deactivate that camera. And that would also work, except I will make one caveat, but let's just go ahead and demo this first. So that camera turns on, camera number 2 then turns on, and when that turns off, we're back to Mickey's default player view. And that's because the time delayer is now activating that camera and deactivating this camera. And most of the time, that will work. You will run into cases, however, where when you're doing it like this, when this camera is activated and this camera is turned off, sometimes there will be a little hiccup in the middle where it'll default to the player's camera for a split second before it goes to the next player view. And that can happen if you've got stuff moving on paths, a lot of enemies in the toy box or something like that. And so really that's not the best way to do it. And so I'm going to delete that link. And the way I recommend doing this would be something like this. You would use the button or some other trigger to activate this camera. And then we're going to use the time delayer to activate the next view. And on this camera, once this camera is activated, we can do a new logic connection when activated, then come over and deactivate this camera. And that's the way I prefer to do it. And that way, the transition will be a lot smoother because this camera will be on and it'll stay on until this camera is activated and running. And then once this one is activated and running, then it turns off the old camera. And so there's never a possibility for a situation where neither camera is active. And so that makes it a little bit smoother. And I hope that makes sense to you. Again, if there's a lot going on in the toy box and you're using a trigger like this time delayer, or something like a button or a dynamic trigger or something to do both deactivating the previous camera and activating the new one, if there's a lot going on in the toy box, there can be a bit of a split-second delay there. When this one's deactivated, and that one hasn't kicked in yet, and it would default to this player camera. So that kind of prevents you from having a hiccup. So once again, activate this camera, wait until that next one is activated, and then turn off this one. So that's kind of the flow for dealing with multiple cameras. Now the next thing to talk about with the camera transitions is the actual transition. And right now, under the properties for these, I'll come over to this one. And we look at the properties. The default behavior right now for the start and end transitions is cut. And so let's say you want to do something different and you want to do a fade. In that case, what you need to do is come over to the next camera in the list and set the start transition on that to fade. And the reason I say to do that, and I'll demo it here in a minute, but you can run into hiccups if you do it another way, and you'll see that in a second, but let's go ahead and test this out. So now first camera is running. When the second one kicks in, it causes a fade. And then 3 seconds later, we're back. Now what were to happen if we were to do an end transition fade here? So if we were to come and set this to fade, for example, we'll come back over here and change this back to cut for the start transition. And again, this isn't the way to do it, but this is going to show you that the order makes a difference. So we start, and now when we transition to that camera, the second camera view, but then a fade happens. And so it does a cut, and then it does the fade. And the reason it does that is because this camera over here is being activated. And so the view switches, and then once the view is switched, then this one comes over and deactivates the camera. And that causes the fade to kick in. But we're already looking at this view, and so the fade happens too late. And so that's why I don't recommend doing that. And also, by the way, if we did fade on both ends of this, so this will now do fade correctly when we switch over, but we still have fade set for the end transition on the other. And so what happens with that is you're going to end up with two fades. So camera 1 is running, camera 2 fades in, and then we do another fade as camera 1 turns itself off. So you have to be careful with the transitions. You're always looking at the next camera when you want to do a transition. So if we want to transition between these, we leave the end transition alone and leave that set to just a plain cut. And the transition should always happen on the next camera. And then if you wanted to do a fade when this one is done, since there is no next camera, then it's safe to do an end transition and set that to fade. And you could even come over to this one and do a start transition so that when this one kicks in, then it would start. So at this point, we would fade in over here. When we switch, this one's going to govern the fade for the switch. And then when this one turns off, it'll do another fade to get back to the regular camera. So that's the way you would do those kinds of transitions. So fade into camera 1, fade into camera 2. Camera 2 is doing that. And then when camera 2 turns off, it fades out. And you'll notice it did two fades, and that's kind of interesting. It didn't do that a moment ago when I tested this out prior to this video. So that's kind of interesting. So sometimes you have to play around with that. Maybe you just put that back to cut and leave it. But those are the principles that govern that. All right, so now that we understand how camera transitions work and the best way to do a transition, let's put that knowledge to use and build a cutscene out of the 6 different camera shots that I set up last time. And so If you haven't seen that episode yet, I highly recommend watching it first, and it's, again, a bit of a long episode, but it's necessary to see how each of these cameras were set up. And since we're going to stitch them all together, let's delete the controls we don't need, just to keep things from being confusing. So this button, that button, this trigger, don't need that. This button, we don't need that. And these I'll leave back here just for testing purposes. And what we're going to do is I'm going to delete this trigger area in a moment. And we're going to use a locator with a dynamic trigger hooked up to it. Because as I pointed out last time, it's very important where the player stands for all of these close-up shots and everything to work. So I'm going to place this locator right here in front of that camera. And then we'll come in and delete that trigger area. And to save time again, I've already dropped a radar marker, a dynamic trigger, and a text displayer that I'm going to use at the end, as well as a couple of time delayers. And you saw kind of why we needed those a moment ago. So the first thing we'll do is let's hook up this radar marker, because I need to replace this trigger area that I just deleted. So we're going to hook the radar marker up to that locator. And we're going to set the properties on this radar marker so that the beacon type is a yellow ring. Beacon location is not this gray toy, but the locator that we connected, and I'm going to turn this on. And so now, instead of that big trigger area, that tells the player exactly where I want them to go. And instead of the trigger area, we'll use this dynamic trigger to set everything off. So on the dynamic trigger, we'll do a new locator connection. We'll connect up to this locator. And again, that will set up a radius around the locator. And on the properties for the dynamic trigger, the target, once again, is not this creative toy, but the locator. And for the trigger distance, I'm going to set this to 2, because I want the player to be right there on that spot. Okay, and now that that is set up, we'll go ahead and hook up the dynamic trigger to begin the cutscene. And so we're going to come up to New Logic Connection, and this is kind of like the director triggering action. And so on the dynamic trigger, when the player enters the radius around that locator, when entered by player any, first thing I want to do is cue the smoke at the end of the screen, at the end of the street. So we'll come down to our effects generator and we're going to play looped. We're going to come down to the smoke category and we're going to play the large area smoke. And again, that's going to cover up the enemy generation and also set a little bit of a scene for a little atmosphere for the scene. On the dynamic trigger, we'll do a new logic connection when entered by player any. So in addition to starting the smoke, we're going to come up and activate the first camera, which is the aerial shot. And once again, activating the camera doesn't start it moving around the path. So we need to make one more logic connection here. So we'll do a new logic connection on the dynamic trigger when entered by player any. We'll come up to the path, and I'm going to say reset and play. And so now this will start the smoke at the end of the screen and start the first camera shot in our cutscene, which is the camera moving around this arc. And so we'll see Mickey over here at the locator. We'll see Mickey, or we'll see the smoke at the end of the screen, the end of the street. And then last time we set up this point to end the camera shot. And right now this path point is deactivating this camera and doing a reset and stop on that path. And we also need this to activate the second camera in our shot. And so on this point, we're going to do a new logic connection. When the point is reached by the object on the path, which is the camera, we're going to come down to camera number 2. which is our pan shot. And we're going to activate that camera. And once again, activating that camera does not start it moving along the path. So we'll come over to our path point, do a new logic connection when the point is reached by the object on the path. So when camera 1 again reaches that, we'll come over to this path point for path number 2, and we'll say reset and play. And so now this camera will start moving along this path and panning out from behind Mickey and looking down the street at the enemy. But of course we got to have an enemy, so the other thing we'll do on this path point is a new logic connection when the point is reached by the object on the path. We'll come over to our enemy generator, our enemy wave generator, and generate that wave. Now there's a lot going on, so just to recap. So when Mickey approaches the radar marker, that locator, that will cause this dynamic trigger to begin the cutscene. And that will activate this first camera, start it moving around the path, and start the smoke at the end of the screen. At the end of the street. I don't know why I keep saying screen. When camera number 1 reaches this point on the path, that will turn off camera number 1 and stop it from moving. It'll start camera number 2 and start that moving and generate the enemy down on this end. All right. Now last time we had this set up so that when the enemy is generated, he's going to come over to this path and start walking the path. And when he enters this trigger area, that will activate camera number 3. And so that's already set up. So camera number 3 will automatically, from last week automatically, start recording and start moving along the path. So that part of that is already done. And that will start tracking the enemy as he walks down the street. So the next thing we need to do is when to stop this. And right now, based on what we had last week, I have a defined duration turned on for this camera of 10 seconds. I want to turn that off. And we're going to do something a little bit different. So what I want to have happen is we're going to move this trigger area and make it wider. So I'm going to pick up this little locator and we're going to move it so it's about halfway along the path. And then we're going to come to the trigger area and we're going to do a new logic connection when exited by AI enemy. So when the enemy gets to the halfway point on the path, we want to activate the next camera in the sequence. And this is going to be camera number 4, which is the over-the-shoulder shot for Mickey. So we're going to activate that camera. And this camera isn't, as I mentioned last week, isn't where I really want it to be. I had moved it out of the way to demo it. This needs to be right over top of this other camera and back just a little bit. So we're going to place it there. So when the enemy reaches the halfway point on this path, that will activate that camera. And we need to turn off then the other camera. And so we could use this trigger area to do that. But again, it's probably safer to do it this way. So a new logic connection on this camera, when activated, come over and turn off camera number 3. And so now camera number 4 is running. This is the over-the-shoulder shot looking past Mickey down the street at the approaching enemy. Okay. So now the next part of this occurs when the enemy reaches the end of this path. And at this point I want to do the close-up on Mickey. And so on this path point, I'm going to do a new logic connection. And right now this is set up to deactivate that number 3 camera, the tracking camera. And we've already turned that off from camera number 4, so I'm going to delete that link. And what I need to do instead is a new logic connection. When the point is reached by the object on the path, and that would be the enemy, we want to come over to camera number 4, or camera number 5 rather, which is the close-up shot for Mickey, and we're going to activate that. And because we removed that trigger plate, we need to put this right up here on Mickey so we have a close-up. And again, I set that up last time, so how that works, if you want to see how the close-up works, because it's more to it than just placing that camera. Okay, and then on camera number 5, new logic connection on the close-up camera. When this is activated, we want to come up and deactivate the over-the-shoulder shot. Okay, now I want this to run for about 3 seconds. And so on this camera, I already had this set up before to run for 4 seconds. Let's just turn that right off. So activating this camera right now, it's going to stay on until we turn it off. So let's come over to the path point. New logic connection. When the point is reached by the enemy walking along that path, we'll come over to this time delayer and start the delay. And let's set the time delayer for 3 seconds. So we're going to have a 3-second close-up on Mickey. Okay. And then on this time delayer, when that 3 seconds is up, we're going to do a new logic connection. When the delay is completed, we'll come down to our last shot, which is the low angle shot looking up at the enemy. And we'll activate that. And once this camera is activated, new logic connection when activated, we'll come over to the close-up on Mickey and deactivate that camera. And now this camera, again, I had this set up for a 4-second delay. Let's go ahead and turn that off. And this camera isn't quite where I wanted it to be either. So let's delete this flag, which we don't need anymore, and let's move this camera right up to the enemy. So just like that. And now because I can't trigger when this camera is deactivated, I've got another time delayer there. And so on this time delayer, in addition to activating that camera, when the delay is completed, I want to kick off this time delayer. And for this time delayer, again, under the properties, we'll set this up to be a 3-second shot. And when this time delayer goes off, we'll do a new logic connection. When the delay is completed, we're going to turn off that camera. And when the delay is completed, I want to come over to my text displayer. And I want to tell, I'd love to tell the player draw, but it doesn't, there's nothing in here for that. So instead we'll come down to start, and we'll just say go. And on the text displayer, under the properties, we'll leave the text duration at 2. Text style we'll set to banner. And there we go. So what I've done is basically string the cameras together, and different things are triggering each camera. So when this one reaches the end of this path, that starts the next camera and starts the enemy walking. When the enemy enters this trigger area, that starts camera number 3. When the enemy exits the trigger area, that starts camera number 4 and turns off camera number 3. And then when the enemy reaches the end of this path, that turns off camera number 4, turns off turns on camera number 5, starts that time delayer. When the time delayer goes off, that starts camera number 6. And I did use this to turn off camera number 5. And so you can see how I'm stringing this together based on events that are happening and switching between the views. And I think that is everything. Oh, one more thing would probably be a good idea. Let's come over here to this time delayer and do a new logic connection. When the delay is completed at the very end, we should probably turn off all the smoke. So we'll stop looping the effects. All right. And with that, I'm just double checking. I think that's everything. All the cameras are in the right spots. Durations are set up, and I think I've connected them all. So let's come out and give it a try. So, Mickey approaches the Wild West town. We walk right up to this radar marker. That starts the first camera, and you can see the smoke at the end of the street, and Mickey under the radar marker. Now the camera pans out from behind Mickey, and we see the enemy starting to walk out from the smoke. And here he is walking up the street. It's looking pretty ominous. And when he gets a little bit closer to town, then we switch to the over-the-shoulder shot, and we see the enemy from Mickey's standpoint. Oops, forgot a camera transition there. Now here's the close-up. Close-up on the enemy. And go! Whoa, I walked back into that trigger area. Okay, and there's the enemy. Let's get out of these views. Oops, wrong button. Alright, so that didn't go quite as planned. And the reason it didn't go quite as planned was because I had forgotten to turn off the defined duration on that camera. And that building has now been damaged. Let's see, can I walk up and fix it? Don't want that to be a distraction. Might have to destroy it first. Ah, well. Okay, one more time. We're really close. All right, Mickey enters town. Here's our aerial shot. The smoke at the end of the street starts. Now the camera pans out from behind Mickey. Here comes the enemy. Here's the shot from behind. So we're not seeing his face yet. We just see this mysterious person entering town. The over-the-shoulder shot, which should now stay until the enemy reaches the end of that path. And Mickey's like, I ain't impressed. I'm just looking around. Let me show you what I can do, buddy. Okay, close up on Mickey, close up on the enemy. And go! Time for our showdown. And I don't know why that just kicked off again. There's another something or other that's kicking that off. I'll have to go and take a look at this. I'll be right back in just a moment. Okay, so what's happening is that this camera number 3, the tracking shot, that camera is still moving after we turn it off. And when that camera reaches the end of this path, that's what's messing everything up. And so the way to fix that is when camera number 4, the over-the-shoulder shot, is activated. We'll do a new logic connection when activated. Not only do we want to be turning off this camera, but we should be resetting it. And again, you'll notice I can't connect to this thing twice to do that. And so what we're going to need to do is come over and I'm going to pick this logic gate up and drop another one down. And again, we'll just use this as a pass-through. So, when the enemy exits this trigger area, that turns on camera number 4. The camera number 4 turns around and turns off camera number 3. And so on camera number 4, we also want to do a new logic connection. When that is activated, come over to the logic gate and input. And on the logic gate, new logic connection on output, we're going to come over to that camera. And under the toy box path, I'm going to do a reset and stop. And that'll put the camera back there at the end. And so it'll stop moving and it won't hit this path point at the end. Because remember, this camera has been following the enemy. And so the enemy reaches this path, but so does the camera, unless we put it back. And that's the piece I was missing. So, one more time. Okay, so Mickey enters the town. And there's the smoke at the end of the street. Mickey's under the radar marker. Switch to camera number 2. Cue camera number 3. Enemies walking up the street. And now when he exits that trigger area, not only does that turn off camera number 3 right there, but it puts camera number 3 back at the beginning of the path and resets it so it's not moving. And so now Mickey is here waiting for this guy to come up the street. Cue the close-up on Mickey. Cue the close-up on the enemy. And go! And now we can have our Western-style shootout. And there he is. He's all taken care of. So there we go. With that, my mini-series on cameras is done. Now, next week, I would like to return to my Fantasia toy box and continue our lessons there. But I can't do that. And the reason I can't do that is because, well, I have a small confession to make. So far in this series, I've tried to avoid using Creativitoys that we haven't talked about yet, and only use the toys that I've taught you how to use so far. But in my episode today, I cheated. Before I started recording today's episode, I hooked up a toy that you haven't seen me use yet, and I needed it in order for the cutscene to work properly. And so next week, before we return to my Fantasia toy box, we're going to revisit this toy box one more time so I can show you the toy that I used, explain why I used it, and then teach you how to use it yourself. So thank you for watching today's episode, and I hope your faith in me isn't too shaken. Be sure to subscribe to my channel or follow me on my blog so you don't miss the next episode. For now, Mickey and I are signing off, and I'll see you next time.